Our next speaker will talk about the importance of transparency when reporting after a huge cyber incident, as well as when talking and communicating with your customers and as well as investors after an huge, you have fallen after as a victim of a huge cyber incident. How to do that properly, not to again be the victim of the blame game. That will be talked with Merike. So please, I want to welcome on stage the founder and the Chief Information Security Officer of the Double Shot Security. Merike, the floor is all yours. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. And I am very happy to be in Latvia. A little bit about myself, you'll see it in the speaker's information, but I have dual citizenship. I'm Estonian and American, and I live in Seattle, but I also spend quite a bit of time in Estonia. So one of the things that I'm very, very passionate about is that everybody has to stop lying, right? We have to be more transparent overall in terms of what we're doing in organizations from a nation-state perspective. And I will say that I think in the Baltics, right, transparency is a very key element. In some other nations, maybe not so much, but we really need to have more transparency because transparency creates trust, and also then you will understand what you need to protect against. So let's just get going here. So global criminal behavior is absolutely rampant, and it has been increasing by leaps and bounds over the last couple of decades. Every single day, you hear and see about a breach. And it doesn't matter if it's the entertainment industry, the travel industry, healthcare industry, financial industry. I sometimes wonder, I think all of my private information is out there. What can I do to protect myself? In the US, I do credit freezes because it's the only thing I can do personally to make sure that nobody's trying to create credit cards in my name and what have you. But we really have to understand that all of this information, our private information, our ID numbers, maybe healthcare information, might be out there for the criminal underground to barter, sell, and maybe potentially target you. I took a look at this last night. Thank you for having my new slides up early this morning. But I took a screenshot of this. And this was from itgovernance.eu. And it shows in Europe the 10 biggest breaches. Okay? Now, there's others. In the US, there was a healthcare breach in February. 145 or 50 million individuals were breached. And the information that was out there from the healthcare perspective, it's everything with insurance information that you have for healthcare. It's maybe doctors' diagnoses, treatments, right? Who paid for what? I mean, it is really pretty interesting, okay? And what I look at is that we as individuals, I know that most everybody in this room, right, we understand how important security is. And as Baiba said, we need to celebrate our chosen profession in that we do have sleepless nights, right? We work on weekends, whatever we do. But we also have to be advocates, what Cornelia said, tell stories with other people in our organizations so that everybody really understands how important, and I started to use the word digital safety rather than security, and there's many organizations now that are using digital safety to really bring to the understanding how important security measures are. So why are things so broken? For one thing, there are just billions of new devices. Mikko Hipponen wrote a book about if you're connected, you're vulnerable. Absolutely true. Your televisions at home, they're connected, they're vulnerable. Some attackers can get in that way and start exploiting your home networks which might then connect to your businesses, right, if you're working from home and remotely. There's also been an increase in criminal sophistication. Right? Over the decades, they've learned more about network infrastructures, they've learned about protocols, they've seen what vulnerabilities exist. Social media is used for weaponization. There's so much open source intelligence there. It's awesome, or not. And automation. I think automation is the critical factor in terms of why things are so broken, because you can speed up actually doing scans, looking at what ports are open, and looking at vulnerabilities, exploiting 0 days, what have you. And I'm not even going to use the term AI, but I just did. Right? And so you have big data available, you have automated systems. So we really have to be much better at transparency in terms of our organizations and what actually is our security posture, what are our controls, where are the risks still? Because if we're not truthful within our organization about that, how do we even know what to defend? I wrote a blog about this a few years ago because there's always a trade-off between convenience versus security versus privacy. And I'll tell you, convenience usually wins. Every time I go to a certain financial institution, a check mark is clicked, oh, trust this computer. I always have to unclick it, because I'm like, no, I don't want you to trust that. I want you to ask me for the other code. I always want to enter it. Many people don't, okay? But so many of these services, they really go more towards the convenience for the user rather than perhaps security or maybe even privacy. And there is always a balancing act. What is it that they usually say? You know, you can only have 2 out of the 3. What is it? Love, money, and health. You never have all 3. And that's the same with convenience versus security versus privacy. Another thing is that, and of course in these regions here, we very well know this, that the nation-state attack trends are increasing. Right? So if we look at the evolution of kind of attacks, there was a lot of reconnaissance done early days, and then some targeted destruction. And you know, it's morphed all the way to espionage as a service, of course, information disinformation campaigns, and then also with automation and AI, right, things are just exacerbated. So getting to transparency, what is actually meant by transparency? Very simple. In a business context, it's being open and honest. Right? Don't hide what you're doing, right? But actually tell the truth in terms of where you are with things. And what I've noticed is that the entire security ecosystem really needs to understand that there's improvement needed everywhere with overall transparency. I used to work for a vendor. I used to work for Cisco Systems back in from 1993 to 2000. And I ended up initiating creating the first security initiative back in 1996-97. Okay, so I've been doing security for quite a long time. And one of the things that I recognized that as a vendor, if you're not transparent about your security posture, which ports are open by default or not, right, just as a simple case, then an organization will only know that they have a problem when there's a big attack that could potentially make them go out of business. Right? When you were in the early days just dealing with network connectivity, right, does packet A get to packet B? It was very easy to say if things weren't working because you weren't getting the information. But from a security perspective, you don't really know whether or not your security controls are working until you actually have a realized attack. That's a problem. And so for over 2 decades now, I've been an advocate for making sure that vendors actually talk about their default settings. And they don't do that still today. Right? You have all these other vendors that do scanning, Shadow Server for one. There's a number of other organizations where you can then get reports on your own environment to see which ports are open, right, on certain critical servers and devices and what have you. Well, why can't you know that from just the vendor? Right? Because then you can create some kind of scripts internally to say, well, our policy is that we don't have these ports open, or we want our configuration to be X, Y, and Z. And so if you have this device, right, you can just have a script, deploy it, and you're done. Instead, now you got to do a lot of fact checking, you got to do your own scanning, right? It's a huge waste of time. Vulnerabilities, right? It'd be nice to know when the vulnerabilities exist. Sometimes vendors try to hide it. Now, there is an issue with responsible disclosure, right? You don't necessarily want to advertise to everybody publicly that, hey, this vulnerability exists, if you don't have any patch to fix it, right? And that can be exploited. But again, it's a difficult problem. But you don't want to hide vulnerabilities to the extent that you never disclose them, right? And so for me, it's from the vendor product and services perspective, right? You have to be really good about being transparent about these issues. From a corporate organizational security, and I'm going to end this talk with a story on corporate organizational. I have another story from a nation-state perspective. But I have been a CISO, and I am a virtual CISO to some environments. And what I've seen over a decade, and I'd say 2, things are improving, but they're not where they should be. From an organizational security perspective, there's a lot of gray areas, and I will say, I'm on camera, but I will say it, that people actually lie. They lie about what they're doing in the organization. And this, to me, is the biggest problem that we have today, because if you work in an organization and your staff is telling you everything's fine, we've actually patched, we've changed the password when we said we would, but you haven't, that's a problem. Because then you have unknown risks in your environment. And this happens. Right? There's incident response. What do you tell to whom? Right? And I'm an advocate that internal to the organization, you need to trust your employees. You need to trust everybody in that organization so that you can actually say what is really going on. Now, there has to be a balance if there's a criminal investigation, okay? And making sure you preserve evidence and that the evidence isn't made public, and then maybe it can't be used in a court of law. But I find that in many organizations, it's this need to know, where the need to know is way too constrained, so that the organization, the employees, people whisper, people wonder what's going on. And because of the lack of transparency, you don't foster trust. And so that's something that needs to be improved on in many, many organizations, and I would say globally. Transparency of data collection. We all know that we have no clue where all of our data goes. Right? It's really funny when I have my phone turned off and I'm talking about some topic, and I look at Facebook or some other social media and I see advertisements about something that I've talked about that I've never searched for. How does that happen? Magic. Right? Do I like it? No. And I bought a television about 8 years ago, 9 years ago. Yep, I'm a geek. And I bought it because I was testing IPv6. And it was between 2 televisions that supported IPv6. So I just picked one. And then I came home and I'm like, oh, It's an Android device. And over the years, it's been really interesting as I've done firmware upgrades, what is actually going on behind the scenes with that television. All of a sudden, this microphone icon popped up. I'm like, huh? You know, why is that there on my television? And then I'm also one of these people that I look at all the screens in terms of what's turned on by default. Right? There was a setting that was turned on that said, yes, send this data. It wasn't in normal, you know, English, so I have no idea what data is being sent where. But it was ticked on by default, so I just ticked it off. And every time I do an upgrade, right, these darn things are ticked on again. Right? I have no idea if it works or not. I could. I haven't had the time, and you know, how much do you do? I could actually put it on the Wi-Fi, you know, look at my, you know, use Wireshark and see what's connecting where. Once I enable Wireshark on my home network with all these different devices, I have a zillion, like I have so many packets on the wire. So sure, I could do that, right? Who in their normal homes, who's not technical, will do that? Right? So I would like to know, I would actually like to know from the TV vendor, what is it doing? It's very obscure, not exactly transparent. So there's all kinds of data collection that's happening, right, within all of our connected devices. It'd be really nice to know who has the data, where is it going, what is done to protect the data, you know, how is the data potentially being abused? Right? We don't really know. And I know that there's been advocacy groups for data transparency, right? It's been ongoing for many, many years. How successful they are varies. And I mentioned this before, I mean, especially with COVID, the home network is the extension of the business. I've been working from home since 1994. Okay, I lived in Santa Cruz. The job at Cisco was in San Jose. I had to traverse this mountainous path, and there was landslides, so I called my boss, and I'm like, hey, you know, I'm sorry, I'm not going to be in until noon when they clear everything up. And his comment to me is, I want you alive. You have a laptop, work from home. And so that started my kind of, you know, sometimes working from home scenario. But one thing that was always very interesting, even way back then, was thinking, okay, so where's my data going, right? If I'm using things for personal connectivity, if I'm using a virtual private network at that point in time, right, was it that the corporation is seeing or not seeing? And so you really have to look at when somebody is now working from home, and let's say the entire family is sharing a network, or even possibly a computer, right? Might even be a work laptop, right? What is actually happening, and what might be disclosed, right, from a business perspective? I mean, security is all about being detail-oriented, right, and being transparent about the details. And I always think about point A to point B, where is the data going, right? Where is it all traversing, and who has potential access to it? And so if you're not encrypting and keeping that data confidential, right, who could potentially see it? And if it's sensitive, what happens? So vendor transparency. There's two companies that I very much admire. They're large, and I liked what the speaker this morning said in the plenary, that as you mature, you're willing to share more. So this particular set of screenshots is from Salesforce. And what I like about Salesforce, if you type in compliance.salesforce.com, you get all kinds of information in terms of their compliance aspects. Now, the one thing that I found really interesting is the vulnerability scanning. So external vulnerability scans are actually there for you to look at. I think that's pretty decent transparency. And what I liked about Salesforce, because I discovered this about 5 years ago, where they were really building up the transparency of their security compliance and what they were doing. GitHub is another company that does this, right? And I think other companies are starting to follow that model because, again, when I'm in a CISO role, the more trust I have in a particular vendor is usually because they're transparent about some of this information. And it's easy then for either myself or team members to go and look things up rather than wasting a lot of time with meetings, maybe somebody doesn't want to divulge something, what have you. So the more transparency that a vendor has, right, again, keeping in mind that you do want to not make information available that can be used against you, right? So I have trust that whatever vulnerability scans they have, right, they're also probably really good at their internal security measures, right, because they feel confident that they can actually publicize this. So it kind of goes hand in hand that if you have a mature security program and you have an organization where even the executive team and the board really truly cares about overall security, not just saying they do, right, but actually in action do, that you actually build programs where you can be more transparent. So another company that I very much like, and I know a lot of my colleagues around the world even, look at Cloudflare when something first happens. Because they have a corporate, I learned this yesterday. I was at a speaker's dinner, and I happened to sit across the table from Cloudflare. I'm like, oh, hey, I'm using you guys in my talk. Because whenever something happens, any incident, right, the corporate culture is all about transparency, because they want the customers to trust them. And it's so good that I even looked last night, and I'm like, if you look at this one, impact of Verizon's September 30th outage, that was 2 days ago, right? So in the US, I saw some social media posts about, oh yeah, hey, what's going on with Verizon, AT&T, and what have you. I didn't have time to look at it. I didn't care. I'm here. And you know, they wrote something about it, and they continue to update it. I was a CISO during Log4j. They had numerous Log4j updates almost on a daily basis. And I was like, you know, this is like a really good source of information. And they follow the same formula where basically you give a little bit of give a little bit of background. You then explain what broke. And if there's a lot of technical nuances, they even give a primer about how things work technically, so that the reader can understand, oh, okay, here's the nuance, here's how this works, and here's what really happened. They talk about incident timeline and impact, and preventing how will this not be repeated in our environment. You know, how they test the process, maybe some changes that they made, and then implementation of the entire you know, fix and repeating whatever happened. And it's excellent. Right? And the amount of detail that they have is really good. And I wish many organizations would do this, and especially even internally when you do incident reporting. Right? Usually it's a very small team, that the internal CERT team for an organization maybe, but really you have to have the communication, right, even to the rest of the staff in the organization, so that there isn't any kind of hype that goes on and misinformation when you're not actually transparent yourself. So what are the greatest barriers to transparency? Regulatory frameworks, because there's money involved and there's fines for non-compliance. Litigation. In the US, this is so prevalent. Something goes wrong, somebody's got to sue. Somebody's got to be blamed, I got to get money for this. Right? And so there's legal fees and potential penalties. And then there's the media hype. The media hype is rampant. Everybody wants to be first. Everybody wants to have the sensational story. It is ridiculous. Right? A little hint that something goes on, and I don't know, the media just makes stuff up. right? Because they want the clicks or whatever they want. And we don't have the factual reporting anymore that really is necessary. So what are the issues that are created from the lack of transparency? Breach response is slow. Right? The impacted individuals can't necessarily protect themselves because they don't know what's going on, and they may actually be impacted. Information sharing. 10 years ago, I gave a talk at an RSA about information sharing landscape. And it was so funny because a lot of sharing groups work on the principle of you give me. Well, you give me, I give you, right? That's sharing. We should learn this in kindergarten, right? Sharing is good. So, and then you have silos based on trust. There's so many trust groups, right? But that doesn't mean that you're sharing effectively. And the blame game and erroneous information, oh, I hate that. I cannot even begin to tell you. The general chaos and distrust it creates is rampant. And also, it creates stress and despair for a lot of individuals. And I know of individuals who have literally contemplated suicide because their company got breached. They may have been part of the issue, right? And rather than the organization being supportive, and even just social media, right? Just saying, how could you do this? This is horrible, right? And whatever else they pile on, right? Humans are fragile. And you never know what's going on in somebody's personal life. And so I am such an advocate for if you are human and you made a mistake, learn from your mistakes. The organization should support you, and everybody else on the sidelines shouldn't pretend that they're smarter and it wouldn't happen to them. I am dead serious about this, right? We have to stop some of the blame game because it is causing individuals a lot of psychological harm. So yeah, there's a breach. CrowdStrike incident. Right? Everybody wants to be first to say, yep, it was their fault. How could they do this? And I sit there and say, if I'm using CrowdStrike in my environment, do I have a really good business continuity plan? Why am I down for 5 days with critical services? Right? Do I have what I should be having in place to do appropriate business operations? Right? Don't be just placing the blame all over the place. Look at what you're doing, right? And also look at the information that you can get that's actually fact-based and see whether or not in your environment you need to improve. And the main issues to be resolved, and this is a global problem, we're improving on this, right? I used to be so pessimistic and I used to get so sad about things are moving so slow. But then, friends of mine said, look, every industry, building industry, healthcare industry, they evolve over time. And when you look at our digital infrastructures and digital resiliency, right, it's only been 3-4 decades. Right? And so things are improving, a little slower than I'd like, but they are. So breach notification laws, they're kind of getting better. I'll have a next slide on that one. Lack of transparency, again, focus of this talk. We have to be better at just being honest, telling the truth, and saying how things really are. And then the media hype with incomplete information drives me nuts. So breach reporting. In the US, you have 50 states. They basically all have different breach notification requirements. 1 or 2 states have none. And there was a financial institution that I used that a few years back got breached. And I love GDPR, especially in the US, because I say, oh, I'm an Estonian, i.e. EU citizen, what do you do regarding GDPR? And all of a sudden, I get all these people wanting to talk to me, right, from the organization, because they don't want to be fined. And it was interesting with that one financial institution, because I actually ended up getting the chief privacy officer, chief security officer, and chief legal counsel on the phone with me. And once they realized that I was legit, I wasn't going to write anything, I just wanted to have information from my own knowledge, they were very honest and transparent to me and said, we had to write 50 different letters to the individuals that were from different states, just to meet whatever the breach notification requirements were. And globally now, as I look at NIS2, right, 24-hour notification, to start, and other countries, I was working for a company that also was in India a few years ago, and India started to have this draft regulation where it was 6 hours, right? And you're looking at, well, first of all, there should be unification, right? A lot of organizations are global. Why do you have requirements that are all different if you're a global company, right? That's extremely difficult. And so it seems like every country wants to do their own thing. That has to stop. And so there needs to be unification for these regulations and laws, and hopefully we'll get to some of that. Also, from an organization perspective, what is the threshold as to when reporting is required, right? And it varies per organization, and it depends on the leadership. And there are now, with NIS2 in the US, there's FCC regulations, SEC, other countries are creating their own requirements, so that from an organizational perspective, you can then have a much better kind of guideline as to when you have to report incidents and what the requirements are and all of that. But I will bring it back to the fact that there's regulatory requirements and legal obligations where the regulatory landscape does have to evolve to allow for better transparency, right? Because the problem is if you're transparent and let's say you made a mistake, then it's like, well, are you going to get a lawsuit? Are you going to have to get fined even though you're doing the best you can, but you made a mistake, right? Because to me it's always, was it deliberate negligence or was it just the human factor that I made a mistake? So NIS2, I'm sure all of you in this room mostly are aware of this when it comes to reporting. Article 23 is the reporting requirements, and within 24 hours must indicate whether a significant incident is suspected. Within 72 hours, need to update with severity and impact, and where available, indicators of compromise. An intermediate report needs to be given as soon as a CERT or competent authority asks for it, and a final report no later than a month after the 72-hour update. So that's part of the Article 23. Now, my favorite country, Estonia, they have a Cybersecurity Act. It was first created in 2018 and then updated periodically. And they have now created a requirement that, again, to meet with the NIS2 directive, right, that any critical infrastructure provider, service provider needs to inform the Estonian Information Security Authority within 24 hours. And there's a whole bunch of language there. But what's really interesting to me is always the enforcement, right? And there's other things in terms of security measures and all of that. And when you look at this, it ties into the reporting actions, but the violations, right? It's the violations and the penalties that, to me, are what's going to give teeth to actually organizations looking at this. Because money always matters. So I'm going to tell two stories. One I'm going to have a lot more slides on, and that's more a nation state and transparency that got created over time, Okay, the transparency didn't happen right away, but it was also a learning lesson as to how to create trust within citizens. And then the second story I'm going to tell is mostly from an organizational level and how you promote advocacy from a security or digital safety perspective, and also create better transparency internal to the organization and ensure that the leadership also recognizes that transparency is necessary. So Estonia has evolved in its digital society over time. So in the 1990s, right, they created this Tiger Leap initiative that connected all of the libraries and then also the schools. And then over time, they also created two-factor authentication, paperless government, digital identities, and internet voting. Now, they realized that when they became independent in 1991, to actually get into to make advances in their economy, they needed to embrace the internet, right? 1991, absolutely, it was a time. And they also benefited from the fact that they didn't have any legacy systems. Because sometimes the Estonians ask me, but why is stuff in the US so archaic? I'm like, because they can't just start fresh, right? You have to make sure that the old systems still work, right? The legacy systems. So it's not that easy to upgrade legacy systems to a new environment. But one of the things that was really important was the government also helped create economic incentives to adopt these digital services and digital applications. So initially, there was free internet access from the telcos and academia. And then very important, when they started to create the digital ID card, the banks promoted the use of digital ID cards by giving away free digital ID card readers, right, that connected via USB to your laptops and home computers. And so again, it was promotion, so to get the adoption from the citizens to use that. And then I remember in 2006, I met the man who started the Estonian CERT. And we were at a conference together, and at that time, there was a lot of cybercrime activity that came from Estonia. And over like the next 2, 3, 4 years, right, from 2006 to about 2010, internally, Estonia did a lot of work with the police, with you know, other federal law enforcement folks, global law enforcement folks, to act, and with the legal environment, to create stiff penalties and make sure that cybercrime was, that the cyber criminals didn't want to use Estonia as a jumping board for their criminal activities. So, you know, just some kind of foundational aspects. Another thing was creating a legal framework. Right, so very early on in the early 2000s, Estonia created a foundational legal framework so that citizens would understand that they wanted to have transparency in what they were doing, and that the citizens could trust what the government was doing. Right? Because there's always that issue of, can I trust the government or not? And one thing that I really like, I mean, I grew up in the US, right? First time I went to Estonia was 1990. But I very much enjoyed seeing the evolution of what they were doing there from a digital infrastructure perspective, because they were embracing the digital future, right? And they did understand the risks. They had risk assessments that they did throughout the entire time. They were not always in English. Right? And that's something as a takeaway. If you within your countries are doing things and you're, you know, you're informing your citizens, you're informing them in the local language, for the global world, right, community, to understand what you're doing, what can be trusted, to then counter some of the hype maybe for some issues, you need to translate into English. So a foundation of trust in organizations or nation states is also transparency of information. Well, what information is shared by whom, but that also goes hand in hand with accountability. Can I check who has seen my information? And the one thing that I as a citizen, using my ID card, and you'll see where that's important when I talk about some of the issues over the years with the ID cards or some researchers with internet voting, is that I can actually look at where has my ID card been used to digitally sign signatures, and also who has looked at the information. So that level of transparency makes me, as a citizen, feel that, okay, I can at least validate or have some accountability that why did the police look at my information? Right? Why did the taxation board look at my information? Or did somebody sign something with, but wait, it wasn't me. That hasn't happened, by the way. But and I do check, right? Because again, you want to have accountability for what's being done. So anyway, getting back to the story and overall transparency. So after the 2007 attacks in Estonia, they created the Estonian Information Authority. Why? Because they realized that the citizens needed to have the source of truth, right? The source of truth for all things from a digital cyber security related aspect. So if there's something going on, that's where you go. And that's where information gets disseminated. So in 2014, I get an email from Steve Bellovin. Steve Bellovin is a well-known cryptographer. And he says, hey, Merike, meet Joe. Joe, meet Merike. Merike, Joe's looking for a tech-savvy person who speaks Estonian. Naturally, I thought of you. We've been in technical communities, security communities together, so most everybody in the US, my colleagues know I'm Estonian, right, and I speak Estonian. So anyway, he did this intro. Well, Joe turns out to be this gentleman, Alex Halderman, who had done an independent research study on Estonia's internet voting and declared it to not be secure, you shouldn't do it. This was a couple of days before the parliamentary elections. Not really good disclosure, right? And I'm like, huh, what's going on? And so then Alex wrote back to me and said, oh, there was this counter report written by the Estonian CERT, and there might be language barriers, and I'm just trying to understand what's going on. And so then I contact my Estonian technical security colleagues, if you will, and they're like, oh, we're just in meetings with him now. Right? And so as the next couple of weeks unfolded and I tried to figure out what's going on, it was very interesting because what I read in the media and what my US colleagues or other global colleagues who didn't speak Estonian were all saying, oh, this internet voting system doesn't work. And I'm like, why do you say that? Right? And then I ended up pointing them to information, risk assessments that the Estonians had done. They did one in 2003, and that was translated into English. The more recent one from 2010 was only available in Estonian. Right? And so I had to then spend some time to let my colleagues know that the information that you see in the media is not correct. Right? Here's somebody that's trusted. Alex Halderman has done some great work. Okay? And what he did with his independent research, they did find some issues where then the Estonians could improve their system. But they also had some what they called issues that weren't issues because the risks were known and they were addressed. Right? And for the Estonians, the internet voting was critical. Right? And they've done the assessment about how much can you trust paper voting versus internet voting. And the system keeps evolving over the years. So you really have to look at things. And then, there's also, when security research do some research, and let's say they say that this system is bad, maybe unbeknownst to them, there might be some political background to that as to who's funding this research. Right? And so you really need to understand what is going on. And this next issue, right, it all kind of ties to the ID cards. In 2017, right, there was a vulnerability with the Infineon crypto chipset and how they actually created their public-private keys. How many of you remember this? Yeah. This affected billions of devices, okay? It was a global issue. And it was interesting because I woke up one morning and everybody's texting me. I'm like, what the heck, my alarm hasn't gone off yet, right? And everybody wants to tell me about this Estonian ID card issue. And I'm like, and these are my American colleagues, okay, not the Estonian ones. And so I looked into this, and I ended up writing an article on LinkedIn. It's the only article I wrote, and the only reason I wrote it is so that I can provide links to what the Estonians over time had written that showed that they understood the risks, they know what they're doing, they're technically savvy, right? It's the only reason I wrote the article, so that my friends, my colleagues, could look at the links and be like, oh, yeah, okay, they know what they're doing. And what really bothered me with the 2017 events is that authentication tokens were impacted. Your YubiKeys, right? Your trusted platforms, your TLS SSH connections, Microsoft-related aspects, like any kind of encryption system that was using Infineon was affected. Yet what was actually written in public media was red-faced Estonians over ID card security flaw. What? Infineon, right, maybe should own up that, oh yeah, oops, right, mistake made, okay, now we're gonna figure it out, right, and we're gonna give you the updates. But why would the Estonians need to be embarrassed because they're utilizing something that has a flaw? Makes no sense to me. Right? And then you're going, well, why didn't they say YubiKey should be red-faced for, using this Infineon chip? And so it's interesting when you're looking at the overall hype, right? And what do people trust, and what is their takeaway? It's kind of what Cornelia was saying about, what is it that what's the story, and where's the blame game? So organizational story. So that was more from a nation state. And the one thing I do want to say is that the Estonians back in 2011 and 2014, when they had some issues, they weren't necessarily as transparent as they could be. In 2017, they made the decision to be absolutely transparent to everybody because they understood that if you're not transparent, you don't create trust. Right? So from a government perspective, they have continued that model to be transparent, actually made publicly available information or issues that happen. And that Estonian Information Authority website, you get all the information. Again, one source of trust, so all the citizens can see what is actually going on and forget about all the other media hype, right? That's where you go. So organizational story is, when you look at many executive teams, the Chief Information Security Officer, even though it has a C-level title, is often the head of security, and they might not actually be part of the C-level executive team. If you go and look at the executive team for many organizations, and you know somebody that's a CISO, you will see when it's the executive team, their picture is not there. Right? So organizations differ in terms of how they use the CISO C-level title, but very often they're not necessarily part of the executive team. And so promoting security, right, is very important. Legal department also, regulatory compliance and geopolitical policy is usually what they deal with. And then from a security perspective, you're supposed to look at security for all of this. And I have time, so I just have a couple of things that I did want to mention. Whenever I went to executive meetings and I said, you know, what do we care about? Right, from a security perspective, I said two things. We stay in business, nobody goes to jail. And they all looked at me, what? Especially that nobody goes to jail. And I'm like, look, there's all of these regulatory requirements coming up where people are starting to look at, are you being negligent in terms of your security posture, right? And that then, if you look at, you know, how do we stay in business? How does nobody go to jail? It's then you look at overall the business risks, because that's what executives care about and the boards care about. And how do you then articulate what is the important risk for the company? For some, it's just reputation. For some, it's, well, it's reputation, but also making sure that you, you know, follow your regulatory compliance and contractual obligations. I mean, you should do that anyway. But again, it just varies depending on the business and how executives think. And then you have to translate those risks into actionable items, right, from a technical level. But you have to start at the top. Most people start, the security teams start with that. I'm like, no. You have to speak to the executives and say, what are the business risks that you're worried about? And then translate that to the security environment. So you'll see the slides. So I'm sorry, I'm running late. I talk a lot. But you really want to look at what boards should care about. And you have to start with risk. And the only last thing I want to say is with transparency. In every organization I've worked with, I have gone to different teams. I don't care if you're an engineer, a marketing person, a salesperson, said, how is the security team creating friction in you being efficient, right? And you start a dialogue and a collaboration, not in I tell you what you should be doing and why you're putting the company at risk, because that's not true. Everybody works in the company. They're doing their job as best they can. They care about their jobs, and it's a collaborative environment. Call to action. I have to stop. So I hope this was useful.
Thank you. Thank you, Merike. Well, actually, we have a lot of questions online. Are there any on site? If not, I'm going to ask the two that I think that are the most interesting one. So first of all, I think that's on everybody's mind, how to not be too transparent, how not to share too much information so that threat actors can use that and then you suffer much more, how to balance the right level of transparency.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, it's not easy. But I would say that you want, when you get breached, right, and something happens, you need to at least inform the staff that, you know, this has happened, this is what you need to be careful about, and we're going to give you more information as we can and as we will divulge it. You need to create an environment internally to, you have to trust your staff. Yeah. You know, and when you don't want to make something public that you can't protect against, right? And that's something you have to think about, because you want to make public what you can. So again, there's no disinformation, but you also want to make sure that you understand what can a nefarious actor do with that information where you potentially not protected, and you know, then there's a balancing act.
Yeah, measure the risks. Mm-hmm. And another one that's likely a statement, but I can retranslate that as in a question. Like, what do you think if there would be like the perfect environment, the perfect world where there will be no blames, no consequences, and wouldn't that make the things even worse? There would be much more errors and much more vulnerabilities.
Well, we're humans, so we tend to blame somebody.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So I think that I don't think I understand the question, actually.
So if it would be the perfect world and we would be transparent and we wouldn't blame anyone, like we wouldn't do the finger pointing there, wouldn't that lead others like not to care about security as much because there would be no consequences for them? Wouldn't that be even worse then?
The thing, we will never have the perfect world. No, I mean quite seriously, right? I mean, you can talk about theory and what's actually happening in practice. So I think that there's always going to be the issue that, first of all, when you have a breach, right, that's a crime, right? And so you have to then think about what evidence do you have to collect, right? What can you be transparent about, right? So you can never be transparent about everything. But one of the things I want to stress is that we're not transparent enough, right? And in environments that I've been in many, right, people try to hide things. And I think we need to get away from that, because this is why we have so many breaches, because sometimes what we try to hide in terms of what we're not doing correctly in terms of security, well, let's get better at our security controls. And one statement I will make, organizations spend an enormous amount of money on services that they don't use. And so it doesn't do anything for them for security. I've been in environments where they spend $1 million or $2 million for some auditing software. Nobody looks at it, right? And so you have to be smart also about where you're spending the money.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And here's a little giveaway from us as well, with warm socks and candies in the evening.